cannot be heard.
And
Petre,
please not so fast.
Give me some more time.
Not so much.
Give me some more time, and I'll explain afterwards. Okay, so
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your help.
again, on the 20th of February 1985,
Great.
Yeah.
wrote a letter to the and he basically said the same. So, during the Nazi occupation of our country during the Second World War, he claimed that the Roma deportees had been strictly supervised by German soldiers. 35,000 Roma died during deportations because of the march treatment imposed by the German authorities of the region of Transnistria. Yeah? Many of us were literally shot by the members of the famous Einsatzkommando, the troops who operated in that area. So this was already written, most likely with the help of Nikolai Georgia in English. So most of these statements are, of course, false. He exaggerated the number of victims, 200,000 Roma deportees and 35,000 casualties. Einsatzgruppe didn't activate in that area where the Roma had been deported. So the Romanians were those responsible, not the Germans. Yeah. So the Romanians were responsible for this deportation disappeared from Troubles argument. And there were so many other cases. Now, this was the first phase. The second phase, the early 1990s. So finally, where the Roma recognized as an ethnic minority. There was no public debate on the Roma during the war. And maybe this is something I should focus on, or mention at least. For most of the 1990s, there remained a significant gap between Roma survivors on one hand, Roma ethnic entrepreneurs, and the Roma people as a whole. As for the Roma activists, their interest in recent history was limited. They didn't see it yet as a powerful tool for ethnic mobilization. Even in the Roma press, until the late 90s, there were only a handful of references to the deportations. The first oral history interviews, finally, I'm coming to what is supposed to be the core of my presentation. The first oral history interviews carried out in the 90s with Roma survivors were conducted by non-Roma intellectuals such as Radionit and Michel Kelso, both affiliated or connected somehow with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. As before, the survivors' memories remained limited within their families and communities. The state the Roma activists tended to hold accountable for imposing the deportations continued to be Germany, not Romania. And again, I'm coming back to Johann Traube. In 1992, he declared himself as a king of the Roma and said what is now unimaginable, that the Roma were not discriminated against the Roma during his time, 1990s. Moreover, he exonerated Antonescu by declaring that the Roma deportation to Transnistria had saved the Roma from being deported and killed by the Nazis. Such ideas he expressed more often than not. So this was, however, not the only narrative. Others were aware, other Roma activists, of the political potential of invoking deportations and persecutions. However, the impact of these discourses, Roma survivors or activists, on the rest of the Roma shouldn't be overstated. On the whole, Roma NGOs were not concerned about the Holocaust. They didn't try to familiarize the members of collaborators with this, thing, and they didn't commemorate it, let alone make use of it to exert influence on the rest of the Roma Romanian society. They couldn't, they didn't. End of the 1990s, things are changing. So, against the background of the first compensation programs for the Roma survivors, often mainly by Germany. So, we had large amounts of money for Roma in Romania. In the 1990s, this was huge, like 1,000 German marks, so 7,500 euros. It was absolutely fantastic. Interest from survivors and the families grew, putting pressure on Roma activists who at the time served as intermediaries in this compensation process. An example is Agenția Împreună, Gerul Duminică, some of you might know about him. However, they didn't record interviews. They limited themselves to filling out compensation forms. So I think it was a huge opportunity wasted this way. The Roma press started publishing articles with details about compensation and the recent history of Roma, including the deportation. Newspapers, interviews, letters written by survivors, resumes of the application for compensation. Some articles had very clear titles such as "We want more than financial compensation for the bookkeeper." Again, such actions didn't represent any sustained effort to create, let alone successfully disseminate, a coherent historical narrative, where the Roma NGOs back then were not that influential. Concerning oral history, we have the same trend. I mean, few interviews, which were conducted with Romanian Roma, mostly were conducted by non-Roma. So I'm talking about Michel Kelso, and yesterday I also talked to Michael Stewart, who conducted in the late 90s, 2000, 2001, with Andrea Varga some oral history interviews in Romani and Romania.
Andrea.
Yeah. So there were also 7 interviews conducted by 2 Roma, and I'm talking here about the Visual History Archive, and talking about 2 Roma activists, intellectuals, Julius Rostas from CEO until a few years ago, and Diana Sima. I will criticize them a little bit later. So finally, we have the final phase during the process of European enlargement. So since 2003, 2004, I won't get into detail unless necessary. The perception of the Roma deportations has, dramatically evolved. So it was created an institutional framework favorable to the recognition of the Holocaust and the Roma deportations in particular. Roma activists started to present these deportations as the most important and relevant moment of the history. Luiza Trauma, so this is a name we can't escape. Florin Trauma, Delia Grigore, and our friend here, Adrian Fortunoff, and others, started interviewing the Roma survivors, launching documentaries and books on deportation. So the Roma started to be assertive in this field as well. Now, general considerations on all of history, collections regarding Roma from Romania. I would say, and I have a completely different, talking to Semina, idea about this collection. So I also wanted to be critical, to criticize the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Visual Holocaust Archive, even Fortunoff and so on.
But now you have 5 minutes.
Okay. So I think I changed my mind after Semina's presentation. So I continue to be critical, but in the other way. So I would say what they did was too little and too late. Yeah. My problem is not that they somehow offended the Roma survivors by exposing them, by asking questions, by on the contrary, they did too little and too late. So most interviews were conducted late when the number of survivors had already decreased drastically. It was a wasted opportunity. In the 90s, there were still survivors old enough to have been deported as adults and able to offer information accordingly. Wasted opportunity. Most interviews are frustratingly short, under an hour, and superficial. Inflation of interviews, what we have now, inflation of interviews in the last decade, but fewer and fewer survivors. So we have interviews, we don't have survivors. And what I can see is, overlapping, and we can identify advantages and disadvantages. Most survivors were deported as children, so their memories are influenced by this fact. So this has some impact on the memories. You can't compare somebody who was a young adult to a father to somebody who was like 4 or 5. You could, however, make something out of that. But anyway, and a plus, an advantage. However, they are still useful for educational growth. So we'll talk about it. So I'm thinking about this Anne Frank project in Amsterdam, and Carola knows better about that. So the idea was to take kids from nowadays, of course, old people also, but who had been deported as kids, in the idea that their memories, focusing on that time when they were kids, could make children nowadays in their age group empathize or with what happened. So something else, we have overlapping, and this allows for some crisscross double check. What do I say? Somebody conducted some interviews. Maybe they were superficial, maybe they were stupid, maybe the interviewers, of course. Maybe they were clever, but the survivors were not in the mood. And a few years later, or a few months later, somebody else is coming, conducts with the same survivor an interview, maybe asking other questions, and you realize the information could be this way, enriched. Using 2 different, 3 different, 4 different interviews. But this is not what is being done because, frankly, relatively little is known about who conducted interviews with whom and so on. So a solution would be to compare and complete that information. Talking about visual Holocaust archive. So as I said, I'm critical, but from another perspective. Very few interviews, only 7. Rather short, around 30-40 minutes, and not represented. They were conducted on the same day, or dates, 19th of June 1999 and 21st of March 1999. Two interviews were Roma, it was Julius Rostas and it was Diana Sima, fluid survivors from only 2 locations. Diana Sima in Turnu Măgurele and Julius Rostas in Sibiu. And in Sibiu, all these 3 survivors belong to the same royal families. It was Cioabă and Rădulescu, the king and the emperor of Roma. It could have been done so much more. It was United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this is a quote. All history interviews with 8 non-Jewish witnesses, Roma, were victims of persecution, humiliation, and forced labor in Transnistria during the Holocaust. All of them were from Zimnica. On 2 consecutive days, 25th and 26th of September. Massive short interviews, around 30 minutes, even less, 60 minutes. I would say not enough. Fortunoff, and I must agree, and maybe I could, definitely benefit from your help. So I understand there were 4,400 Holocaust testimonies. I don't know if I'm wrong. Only 4 interviews in Romani, none from Romania, and only 2 interviews in Romania, both with Jewish survivors. And one of them is Norman, this brilliant, but he was a kid. He was 6 years old when deported. And this interview lasted for 14 hours. Different tapes, 14 hours. It is beautiful, it was wonderful, it was splendid. But if we can, of course, there are different institutions. I just want to highlight this difference. It doesn't have only to do with those who interview, but also with the survivors of power. Several research teams in Romania were interviewing also Roma survivors. Openly, 1 minute left. Some people being interviewed by different interviews. Nunu, myself, Nicu Furtuna, and others. There are other interviews, collected by anthropologists for small projects. I won't talk about these journals because I don't have time. This is a photo of some work done by the team of Yahadinun. It's beautiful. It was done, But as you can see, there are just, in my view, too many people. You have somebody behind the survivors taking photos. You have 2 people asking questions. You have some witnesses or whatever, family members. You have Patrick Deported there as well. And this is some heavy. Am I critical? Oh, yes, I am. There are just too many people. Am I allowed to? Yes, of course. But here's the problem. They did this in 2015. They did this earlier as well. And here you have Diamante and Elie Stănescu, Roma survivors, interviewed in November 2013. I can't be critical anymore because they interviewed 2 survivors. And when I got, the 2 photos below, where I took them, but I took them later, and you can see the survivor, her husband, died in the meantime. So they were lucky enough, however critical I can be, to have interviewed 2 survivors. No, I might be very proud of my interview guide, of my, non-intrusive approach. But at the end of the day, they survived. They survived. They managed to have 2 interviews and all you. So now, being critical. It's good to be to exercise your criticism. Now let's criticize, and I expect you to criticize me as well. Let's criticize Nicu Furtuna. This is a survivor. I interviewed as well. And he says here, he died like 2 years ago. He was born in 1934, and he interviewed him like 4 or 5, I don't know. And he says he was 90 years old. He wasn't. He would be in 2 years or something like that. So that information is not that accurate. For this one here, he has 2 survivors and saying Constantin Brăila with his wife, also survivor, and so on. She wasn't her ex-wife. No. Her wife died many decades, many years ago. This was just Genovica, the nickname, living on agriculture, and so on. So maybe more attention should be paid to this details. Maybe I was lucky because I couldn't make the same mistakes, especially because of that approach, which implied a lot of attention, of time. I had interviewed him in 2014, and then making this application in 2014, and then meeting him again in September, and then again in December, and so on and so on. So I mean, all these paperwork and information from this. Please just give me.
I don't have a more.
Okay.
This is my last sign. It says, "Please wrap up."
It was the same.
Yeah, I know. That's all I got. I
Okay.
don't have anything more than this.
So,
You just have to listen.
Okay, just 30 seconds. The survivors were old enough to have been deported as adults, were those, except the one on the left corner was born in 1905 and died being 109 years old. All the others were in their maybe early 20s. So it was collecting photos. In some cases, we could find some older declarations, or could be seen as echo documents, talking about what could be done. We could do some comics, we could do some exhibitions, we could go to some other target groups, I mean, children in high schools and so on, and this is based on oral history. And this is another example, coming back to Maria Stanciu. So you have this, I mean, her testimony used in this project by Anne Frank, and then you could make a comic exhibition as well. And, there should be some, I mean, it's something left here, because the ideas for the script, which are supposed to go to the artist, are still to be created by the, and I'm done.
We can talk about this in the discussion. Thank you. Our next speaker is Luiza Medeleanu, and she is a PhD student in the field of cultural studies at the in a multidisciplinary doctoral school, Space, Image, Text, and Territory at the Center of Excellence at the University of Bucharest. And her doctoral thesis is on the image of Roma in cinematography and cultural media productions.
Excuse me, can't hear you.
Speak louder.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you can use the mic.
All right. I'm usually not the one who's accused of being quiet, so I'll speak up a little bit. So she graduated from the Faculty of Philosophy and the Faculty of Foreign Languages, the Romani English Department, with a Master in Philosophy, as well as a degree in Anthropology. She's been working for the last 10 years in the Roma non-governmental field, coordinating educational activities with Roma themes of an intercultural character. Her presentation today, titled "The Social and Cultural Consequences of the Famine on the Roma Deported to Transnistria During the Second World War," it will obviously explore the famine's lasting cultural and social consequences. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just 10 years old. Yeah. I know. This is yours? Yeah. Wait, what happens here? What did you do?
Why you can see it? It's good.
No.
Petre. Yes. You're a coward.
Lecture.
Yeah, but you can see that it's fine. But when we want to switch, you need this.
And how the Naron? Yeah. Okay, so I have everything. Okay, that's good. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm really glad because we are in a real conference. It's been long. So yeah, I'm Luiza Medeleanu. I study cultural studies, so I'm not an historian, and also I'm not Holocaust and Roma Holocaust is not my main topic, and I have to be careful with this. So, as Stefan said, I study Roma images in the mainstream series, but Roma Holocaust is a really sensitive topic in Romania, and I choose to speak in this paper about social and cultural consequences of the famine in the Roma on the Roma deported to Transnistria. So my aim of this paper is to investigate the phenomenon of famine, if I can say it like that, suffered by Roma deported to Transnistria, and cultural and social consequences, of course. But what I want to, be clear for the first time. I will describe this experience of Roma people as it is represented mostly in their conscience, because and in their thinking, because of course, as Petre said earlier, a part of them, they were children when they were deported, and they were really well when they were interviewed, and I am aware that that this fact is a limit of my research, of course. About the theoretical framework. Uh, um, so I analyzed this phenomenon of famine, used the Robert Dick's theory about the social responses during severe food shortage and famine. You will see in a minute who is Robert Dix and what is about his theory, in fact. About methodology, so it will be content analysis, and I will analyze interviews. Old interviews made by Michel Kelso or Raglioni, but also newer, if I can say like that, made by Adrian Fortunoff, Petre, Matei, and also some. I have also some interviews, but yeah, I've made them with Matei Fortuna and or with Petre Matei. But yeah, the limitation is that the survivors were really old, and also they were very children when they were deported. So yeah, it will be a content analysis. Yeah, my sources, it will be archival documents that capture this phenomenon. Archival documents, when I say this kind of, when I refer of this kind of documents, I refer of the documents of state. Like gendarmeries. You will see I have two examples. And of course, survivors' testimonies. So yeah, these kind of documents. Here are two documents. In fact, so it's a document of the Elie Institute about food and how was delivery food in for the Roma deported and for Jewish as well, and another one about nourishment and how these nourishment were delivered to Roma, and of course how they start in fact, and also the soldiers and genders they told in their reports about this starvation thing. Yeah, and some samples of the interviews, because what happened, I read a lot of interviews, already published, and I see that this topic of famine, it came back and came back in all these courses, even if maybe the interviewer didn't answer like, but what you eat from there, but no, they thought about this topic even if nobody asked them directly. So I understood that this phenomenon, in fact, I don't know, so affect them a lot. So here are some samples. Yeah, and about this cross-cultural pattern. So these anthropologists, because Dirks is an anthropologist, studied several populations from different cultures who went through period of severe famine, and Dirks argues that there is a cultural pattern in terms of people's social transformation during periods of famine. So people go through a series of transformation. And these three stages of transformation is alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Sorry. So I made an analysis, and I compare the Dirk stages with the stages of Roma deportation from Romania. So alarm, the first stage for this, for me, behind my analysis, it's evacuation, Roma evacuation, because during the alarm period, people became aware of the danger and became hyperactive, anxious, nervous, and that's according to Dirks. And I analyzed and I believe the alarm phase begins during the forced eviction, Roma forced eviction, when people are being taken by surprise and forced to leave their homes, and they became hyperactive, anxious, stressed. And the alarm phase continues on the road to Transnistria, when people began to actually feel the lack of food. Resistance is like the second stage of the story. In the resistance, people try to develop survival strategies. Their relationship improve. They help each other. They are cooperative. So in the case of deportation of Roma to Transnistria, I analyzed and I compare this stage with life in Transnistria in fact. And identify also some resistance stages, like interfamily cooperation. This is so analyzing the interviews, food processing or new cooking methods, relationship with the locals, as Nico told yesterday. I mean, yeah, they try also to learn their language for survive. In fact, also relationship with the authorities and forced labor, of course, because in interviews I met this topic that if you didn't want to work, so you didn't receive food. And the last stage is kind of exhausted, according to Jill. So is the people became really exhausted and they became selfish. They no longer each help each other, share with others. So they think only about their personal survival. So for the Roma deportation, they were the last period in Transnistria, and they gave him mentally, in fact, and started to eat horse meat or cat meat, as they told. And these kind of foods are considered taboos in Romani culture. So they don't became not interested in fate of others from the family, not even in their children, or even less in the old person from the family. Okay, so this is some consequences of this period in Roma culture that I found analyzing the interviews. For now are some thoughts. You can criticize me, of course. So this period influences Roma culture and also way in which Roma remember the deportation, because it was a traumatic period, and it's really complicated to speak about this kind of traumas. So this period became a shameful period, an unclean one, unclean memory for Roma people. And maybe this is one of the reasons why Roma survivors don't speak about it with their children or grandchildren, because really it's a sensitive topic in Roma families. And of course, yeah, they avoid to remember this kind of period, and it's it's really difficult to do that. And here's some bibliography about how, it's like a bibliography, what books with interviews I consulted by now, and an article of Michael Stewart, how Roma remember and how Roma commemorate in fact this sad period, and really shameful, yeah. Of course, it's not shameful because I say like that, or because when you pass in a trauma, like a victim, you can have this impression that you are the problem. Okay, yeah, I think I finished. I hope I'm in frame. Yeah.
I don't have. Thank you, that was wonderful. I don't have a sign that says you have 5 more minutes, but but we'll use that time for discussion, a lively discussion. So thank you for both of these papers. It was wonderful. I think just a few quick comments. We'll go straight to questions. This is clearly not my area of expertise by any stretch of the imagination, but I did find it quite compelling, Petre, your you are sort of a wonderful counterpoint to some of the things we saw yesterday in terms of compensation, right? So what dramatic differences of in the early in the 50s, where you have Roma survivors left to their own devices, battling against the sort of unfriendly bureaucratic machine, whereas here you're assisting with this effort. Not that the machine is any less bureaucratic, but at least there's quite a contrast to those earlier attempts to gain compensation. I was interested to know, and you can just add this to the list of questions, when you began that effort with this coordination of this org, this NGO, if you intended these oral histories clearly from the very beginning to be future sources for historical research. That I thought that was quite interesting. Also, something else you highlighted was that this compensation documentation as a means of extraction, right, from the former enemy, but also how sort of periods of applications for these compensation can reveal a lot about Roma history and Roma suffering during the war, but it can also reveal a lot about the current memory politics of the regime in which these documents are being submitted. So really, it tells us a lot about post-war memory politics as much as it does about the events of the war. I agree with your sentiment. Your critique is welcome, even of the Fortunoff Video Archive. I would say, though, I absolutely feel that we have to look at every single testimony as both a kind of a miracle and as an absolutely a failed opportunity. But it's easy to, looking into the past at these testimonies already recorded, to be critical of them. We need to have a sort of balance, I think. Your paper, fantastic as well. I think that I don't know much about the topic of the famines specifically in Transnistria with the Roma, but I do think that there are few forms of documentation outside of testimony, first-person accounts, that can really provide us the kind of insight into an experience like hunger and starvation, like testimony. Testimony is really one of the only forms where we can get a sense of just truly a glimpse of what it really felt like to experience that type of starvation. And I find that your quote from one of those testimonies we put on fire was quite shattering. So with that, thank you again for your papers, and we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah. I have a question to Peter, Matei. Thank you both for your contributions. I was wondering, because you mentioned that the research on the testimonies on Roma who have been deported to Transnistria started after 1990. And I mean, there was a big political change in Romania also. Do you see that there's a connection, that this was kind of also opening doors for researchers to come, or that there was more exchange? I mean, there were so much changes politically. I can imagine under communist time that maybe this was not a topic also for different reasons.
No. Okay.
Let's take a few questions first.
Petre, it's a great lecture. Petre, two questions. First, did the Romanian state collect testimony just after the war? And second question, regarding the analyzing and critical of the content. You mentioned the testimony of Ion Choba, that he wrongly accused in this testimony Germans. This was also the practice that I encountered in some of the testimony. For you as a historian, what to do with this kind of testimony? Did this kind of testimony may show that we need more critical analysis of the sources, or just to put them in the historical context of time and circumstances in which is given this testimony.
Ari and then Michael.
Yeah, I have a question for each of the panelists. I'll start with
I think I should write down because I already lost the track. No, sorry, wait, please.
Yes.
Because I thought famine is such an important topic, and I know there are lots of books coming out about it currently too, on the Jewish side. And I was wondering if one. So, do I understand it correctly that it's basically very central to their memory, but in the way Petre also explained the rise of this memory out of a political project, in a way, as the memories. I don't know what we mean by memory here. The rise of these interviews and particular narratives, whatever people's personal memories might be. So and in that context, hunger seems to actually be not important because you don't get money for hunger. Because it was for a very long time that hunger was not seen as a weapon, which it was. I mean, current scholarship understands that starting with the mass starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, actually, killing millions, that this is the main tool, this can be a tool. But generally, historically, over the decades after the war, starvation was seen as a natural effect of hunger, of the war, and thus you always asked about shootings or gas. That's what's the real Holocaust, and the other thing was seen as not real. Today we understand it differently, but that is a very late thing. So I was wondering if one can read this as, in a way, a resistance of survivors, that the stories you're recovering could be read as, like stories of revenge, for example, that were often ignored by historians. But these are actually historians that, in a way, come up against the best intentions of the historians to keep asking them about, sure nobody was shot? So that's my question for you, and for Petre, I also wanted to just thank you. I thought it's incredibly important corrective of a critique of testimonies that can be read as undermining the endeavor that is incredibly important, that needs funding, that needs support, and a critique that can ultimately come across as in itself just a privileged stance of people who profit from them, but can then critique them. But I wonder if there's a way of compromising somewhere, in a sense, because you yourself had quite a bit of critique of testimonies that, for different reasons, you thought didn't work out. Too many people, etc. And I think one can say more about Yachad in Unum and its methods, for example, that have been critiqued. So taking various types of critique together, perhaps where one can agree is that it's about the transparency of the process, that you precisely actually, so the content of your presentation is actually making transparent where these people come from, why they are interviewing, what their motivations are. If this is part of a package, if there's a transparency about from the funding to the collecting to the representing, perhaps this is a way of, in a way, addressing both the concern, the critique, and your very legitimate concern with, well, even extractive, exploitative interview is better than no interview, after all. Which I do. Well, the radical. I won't agree in every example, but for many cases, I think that might be true. So perhaps bringing these together, perhaps they're not irreconcilable. Perhaps we're still actually in the same, actually on the same page, even if it doesn't sound like that. You know.
I'm gonna say that we really only have 10 minutes, so let's let them answer first, and then see if we have any time left.
I guess that.
Please.
Okay, yeah. First, very quick questions. Yeah, I choose this topic because I really, it appeared in interviews over and over again. And yeah, I mean, as you said, it was for sure an extermination methods. Even if at the beginning, the historian or the sociologist, or I don't know, the interviewers, maybe they didn't put the accent on this method and on this phenomenon, because yeah, I mean, when you are in the beginning and there are some few years, after the war, I mean, people are preoccupied on the other things and not preoccupied by this, I said, sensitive topic. And yeah, but yeah, of course, it was also a method of resistance, because they, as you said, as I said, I mean, it's this period, the longer one, the resistance, as Dirk's.
I meant resistance to the interviewer.
Resistance from really. I mean, about the interviews, I know these 2 days. I mean, these 2 days we put a lot of this question of interviews, but I'm aware that some interviews made at the beginning of this period doing interviews, I mean, they weren't maybe the best, but it's in a way understandable because people don't, I mean, they didn't know what it's about, in fact, and it's difficult also for the historian and the scholars to being aware themselves about the topic and about the sensitivity, and then put the right question and find the right approach. So I mean, in this moment, I'm younger. So in this moment, I am thankful in a way because we have these interviews, even if maybe a part of them are not the best. And yeah, I mean, but you also, I mean, you also it's important to pay attention at the context. I mean, we were in 1919, or I don't know. So yeah, people didn't think like that. So it's in for me, it's not. I mean, it's sad, but it's normal in a way. So we have these interviews. So it's important to have an analysis on these interviews and in a proper way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Great questions and remarks. I would start because it seems to be the same question or remark. I agree with you, and actually, I tried to say that from the very beginning. Maybe I didn't manage to, but anything is better than nothing. And even a horrible interview, and I shouldn't call it this way. It's definitely much better than nothing. Once you have something, you could. I mean, anyway, these interpretations, you know, just change in different periods and so on. But you still have something. You have something you could start with, and that's why I'm grateful to these big actors. Although I believe more could have been done. So I disagree on this one with Semina's ideas from yesterday, because, as I said during mine, I just wanted to have more. You know, once they are dead, it doesn't make us any difference that I have maybe a good, or I believe, or I'm proud of myself, of my approach and so on, that I want to make life story interviews and not only focusing on the Holocaust, because even this, in my view, is kind of humiliating to the survivors, because you go to somebody who was just a child and you reduce, his life to what you from above consider to be important, the Holocaust. Yeah. And tell me that. And he was like 5. He doesn't really remember much. Maybe he's trying some efforts to remember, to recollect from what the mom, the dad, the grandfather, or whatever said to him, and he's combining this. This is also important. But in my view, so it would have been great to have this. And the world survivors could do this. I mean, you could talk to them for hours, and you could have very rich information interviews and so on. So as I said, better than nothing. But on the other hand, so if you have two different types of criticism coming from opposite directions, you could be proud because you could play with that. Yeah. So about the first question about the collapse of communism. No, it's not only that. So you have a radical change, the regime change. You had the communism or communist dictatorship. You had then democracy. But this didn't mean necessarily immediate change related to the Holocaust perception or to the Roma genocide and whatever. Because what really mattered in this case, in my view, is rather these compensation, German compensation programs in the late 1990s, and even a little bit later, this European Union enlargement. Yeah, so you have the Holocaust started to be kind of used as a tool, you know, for dismantling prejudices against, you know, at this European level against a minority, which is and so on, and you present them as victims and then resistance and whatever. So it's part of the game, I would say, bluntly said. Then you have this. I mean, this. And I wouldn't present it that, you know, simple. I mean, in terms of money only. You know, you have the money, you have expectations, you have simple people who were deported, were entitled to get the compensation. You know, exerting pressure. And these people, you know, the Roma activists and Roma entrepreneurs realize, hey, we claim to represent them. They want help. We should help them, you know. And this is, if you want, the same had happened to the Romanian Jewish survivors in the 60s or even earlier in the 70s, because the Romanian Jewish survivors put pressure on the you know, chief rabbi and so on to intervene on behalf of them as survivors to make their applications successful. But you have this gap of a few decades. So I wouldn't say that this political change was important, rather something else what came later. About Daniel's, and I'm sorry, I realized I have a notebook only today, so I'm trying to, so you said about this compensation forms which were, you asked,
not just
done.
testimony after.
No, you don't really have testimonies. You don't have testimonies. You have compensation forms which were very simple, even simpler and scarcer information than Milovans showed us yesterday. You had just like name, full name, eventually when he was deported, and if they suffered some. It was it. I mean, just 2-3 lines. I mean, most information has to do with. I mean, most likely it was just the beginning as the Romanian politicians. Romanian secret police envisioned all this process. I mean, it was the beginning of some negotiation process with the Germans, and of course the West Germans refused to enter this negotiation, and he remained like that. But later on, the Romanians still try to make things happen. Made use of some Roma activists, which, I mean, what I showed to you with this chart is much richer in information than what had happened a little bit earlier with all the others Roma activists. But again, you have that. I mean, you said it's not about. You definitely need critical analysis. I mean, you, as a historian, we should do that no matter what. But it wasn't accurate, according to the historical information. I mean, it wasn't the Germans, it wasn't Einsatzkommando commander and so on, but I wouldn't call it not meaningful. It was meaningful because you can, but you always need to know the background, Okay. So it was a lie, but a meaningful lie. And I think Elie mentioned that as well in his family. Romanian Jews did the same as well, or Romanian Jews immigrating to Israel, and the Romanians, I mean, they try to exploit these niches. They try to, get more money, making use of different categories foreseen by the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz, and only late after this. So coming back to your question, all this weren't done immediately after the war, but after the Romanians resumed their diplomatic relations with West Germany, because according to the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz and other, they weren't allowed to. And of course, it didn't work. The Germans had developed a very well defended system of, keeping, especially those from Eastern Europe. Yeah. So
okay. I think we're running out of time. So let's thank our speakers, and just to keep this on schedule, everyone, another round of applause for our speakers, and hopefully we continue the discussion in the break.